Hello and welcome to another edition of This Colorado in Life. I'm your host, Duncan Richards. Today, we will be talking with Sarah Zakeli, archivist for the Steelworks Center of the West, about the history of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the Pueblo Steel Mill. Sarah?
Thank you for having me.
So first off, can you give us some background information on CF&I for those of us who don't know?
The first blast furnace was blown in 1881 here at the Pueblo Steel Mill, and the first rail was produced in 1882. So the roots of CF&I stretch back to 1872, when William Jackson Palmer, who was also the founder of Colorado Springs, started the Central Colorado Improvement Company, which was basically a real estate company at that time that was buying up lands in this area and in other areas in Colorado. And he also founded the city of South Pueblo in 1872, I believe. So that is near the steel mill. And he and his colleagues in the Denver and Rio Grande Railway, they did this because they wanted a source for steel to make rails for the railway. So they needed water, and they needed iron, and they needed coal to do that. And Pueblo was a good place that was near all of those things. In 1880, that Central Colorado Improvement Company merged with other companies to form the Colorado Coal and Iron Company, and that is the company that blew the first blast furnace and made the first rails and really started the steel mill. And then in 1892 is when that company merged with John Osgood's Colorado Fuel Company to form what we now know as the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. And John Osgood, he became the president of CF&I after that merger, and he worked to modernize the mill. So during his tenure from 1892 to 1904, they built many new buildings out there and new mills. So they built a new wire mill and a new bar mills where they made steel bars of different sizes. So that's when the mill really began to expand beyond rails. And let's see. And then in 1904, the Rockefellers took over the main ownership of the company, and they actually owned it until 1944. And then, so during World War II, that was another really important time for the steel mill because they were involved with producing steel products for the war. And they were running at full capacity for most of the war and were actually awarded 2 Army Navy E awards, which is something the government gave to companies who were producing steel for use in the war. And then the post-war was a successful time for CF&I. They acquired many subsidiary companies all over the country, including California Wire Cloth in California, John Roebing's Sons Company, which is in New Jersey, and Wickwire Spencer Steel of Massachusetts. And of course, they were also running the steel mill here, so it was really a nationwide company at that point. And they also did a lot of updates here at the steel mill in Pueblo. In 1949, they opened a new rod mill. And then in 1953, they opened a seamless tube mill, which was unlike any other really in the United States at the time. And that's good. And then in the 70s, things started getting rough for the steel mill here and for the entire steel industry in the United States. A recession, and there was competition from foreign steel, and things didn't go very well. And then in 81 and 82 was really a bad time for the steel industry, and it affected Pueblo. They laid off a huge percentage of the steel mill employees. In 82, the unemployment rate reached 18% in Pueblo, so it was a really rough time on the economy of the city. And despite that, CF&I operated for another 7 years, but then in 1990 they filed for bankruptcy, and then in 1993 they were bought by the Oregon Steel Company, who operated the mill, but they didn't produce a whole lot. And then in 2007, that company was bought out by Evraz, a Russian company who operates the mill still today. And today the mill is only doing making steel from recycled steel. So they do not do mining anymore of any type. So it's just a recycle operation. But they are still the third or fourth largest employer in Pueblo, so the steel industry is still actually fairly important here.
The mill obviously played a huge role in the history of Pueblo and the surrounding areas, whether it was causing Pueblo to be called Pewtown, creating a melting pot, or bringing in coal from mining areas. Care to explain?
Pueblo earned this nickname thanks to the steel mill. Making steel requires the intensive heating of many different minerals and chemicals, and that produces a lot of smoke, which doesn't smell very good. So Pueblo was known as Pewtown. The influence of the steel mill cannot be overstated for the city of Pueblo. If it weren't for the steel mill, Pueblo, I think, would be a very small town without a lot in it. So work at the steel mill attracted thousands and thousands of immigrants from many different countries to Pueblo. And that made it one of the most diverse cities in Colorado, if not the entire western United States. At the turn of the century, there were dozens and dozens of languages spoken right in Bessemer alone, a small neighborhood around the steel mill. And many of these immigrants were Mexican, Italian, and Slovenian, and we can still see those influences today in Pueblo, especially with the restaurants and the bars you'll see and things. They owned mines in Los Animas County near Trinidad, in Huerfano County near Walsenburg, and also in Fremont County, which is near Canyon City.
Throughout CF&I's history, there were many strikes. When were they, and how long did they last?
Strikes were always a concern for steel mill owners and managers because they were and are so disruptive to production and ultimately a company's bottom line. One big national steel strike that affected the Pueblo mill was in 1919. And like many other steel mills in the United States, the Pueblo mill closed down in November of 1919, and it was a fairly short strike. They opened again in January of 1920. And then the biggest one, at least during the company's history, was in 1959. It was a national steel strike, and the Pueblo mill was closed for 116 days, which, as you can imagine, really, it's like a third of the year that they were not operating. So that is a very big deal. And of course, there were 8,000 employees that walked off the job. So there was 8,000 employees not working during that time in Pueblo as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, that's all the time we have today on This Colorado in Life. We hope you'll join us next week when we talk to Jim Bishop, the man behind Bishop's Castle. And remember, support for This Colorado in Life comes from my parents' generosity and willingness to pay for me to go to college. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Pop. I love you guys. Have a great day.